Hey listeners, last year was our 15th year of the best in food storytelling. As we head into 2025, we're kicking off a contest in collaboration with the podcast series Feast and Harmony and Sixth Man, where you have the opportunity to win a 4-night cruise for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, a food, wine, and spirits festival at sea. When you donate to HRN, you'll be entered for the chance to win a porthole cabin for 2 on Chefs Making Waves, sailing May 5th through 9th, 2025, from Miami to Cozumel, Mexico on Norwegian Gem. You'll also support another year of great food storytelling with a portion of your donation going toward disaster relief for the food and beverage communities within Western North Carolina and Southern California. This cruise is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for culinary adventurers, featuring top celebrity chefs including Jonathan Waxman, Antonio Lafaso, Robert Irvine, and many, many more. There's a myriad of experiences such as restaurant takeovers, live food and mixology demos, themed parties, and more. To enter your chance to win, please visit heritageradionetwork.org/cruise. Terms and conditions apply. You must be 21 or over to enter. That's heritageradionetwork.org/cruise.
This episode is brought to you by Wisconsin Cheese. Wisconsin, the state of cheese, makes half of the nation's specialty cheese and wins more awards than any other state or country. Our heritage and traditions, master cheesemaker program, and the American propensity for innovation all put Wisconsin on the cutting wedge of cheesemaking. With over 600 varieties of cheese to choose from and 5,500 national and international awards and counting, get ready to turn your refrigerator into a trophy case. Enjoying a Wisconsin cheese is basically like winning a gold medal in culinary achievement. Set your mind at cheese. When you bite into a wedge of Wisconsin Wonderful, you know it is made with the ultimate skill and passion possible. Find your next favorite cheese at wisconsincheese.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hey, welcome to Beer Sessions Radio on Heritage Radio Network. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host. It's our 16th year with Heritage Radio Network. And support us, become a member, heritageradionetwork.org. So when we talk about great beers and you know the history of craft beer in America, there's one beer that always had a cult following, and I'm looking forward to talking about today. So let's have our guests introduce themselves. I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host of Beer Sessions Radio.
And hey, everybody, this is Andy Farrell, Brewmaster, Bell's Brewery.
All right. So this is pretty cool, Andy. There's a lot going on with Bell's and Two Hearted, but it made me think a lot about, what Two Hearted meant to, the Midwest, Michigan. And my intro story is, way back when, I don't know if it was 2012, but sometime around then, there was so much buzz about Two Hearted. We got to meet Larry Bell, the founder, and Bell's came to New York City, which was huge then because it hadn't been in New York in my whole career, and there was so much buzz about it. The rollout was better than New York City Beer Week. It was the whole week. Every great account was featuring Bell's, and I'm pretty sure Larry Bell came out as well. And it was just like Two Hearted, was just all over the place. And I'm so thrilled to talk to you because you're the brewmaster. We're going to talk about some of the secrets and, what makes Two Hearted so special and everything else. So, Andy, welcome to the show. Let's just go backwards and let's start with you. I know that you're a native of Kalamazoo, Michigan. So why don't you tell us about how you started working at the brewery at Bell's? I know you worked there a long time. What Bell's and Two Hearted means, to you and your community.
Yeah, sure. So I started working at the brewery. I'm going on my 25th year. I started working there in the year 2000. I started at an entry-level position. So my first job at the brewery was actually as a keg washer. I was already super passionate about beer. My older brother was a home brewer, so that had kind of gotten me started. And as a local kid, he had been involved in the early days at Bell's, working as a seasonal worker. And at the time, I was going to school kind of intermittently a little bit of a lost soul in my early 20s. And he had connections at the brewery and kind of hooked me up with the crew that was working there at the time. Much smaller brewery, much kind of tighter, different crew, different time in craft beer completely. And that's really how I started. So, you know, came on as an entry level worker working in the packaging team. And then quickly that turned into something that I realized was even more of a passion. There was a real kind of counterculture element to craft beer at the time that was really attractive to me. I was into all that, and the idea. It's ironic now, Jimmy, the amount of time that I spend in meetings that I spend on my laptop. But at the time, it was really attractive to me, the idea that I could get into a job with a bunch of cool people, pretty eclectic group of folks, and I wouldn't be working on a computer all the time. So, that's really where my journey at Bell starts, is there.
When you first started and you were washing kegs, when was the moment that you knew that this was a job you liked?
It was pretty quick. People, the thing that was really attractive about beer, about the industry at the time. First of all, I am 100% someone who landed at the right place at the right time, and recognize how blessed I am to be someone that happened for. And right away, the people were cool. It was like kind of place where people were really accepting. That's always been a part of the culture here at Bell's. It continues to this day. And we just it just clicked right away that, hey, people are cool, people were chill. And so from a lifestyle perspective, I thought that could work out for me. I had a girlfriend at the time who was in grad school. A lot of things really worked out super well. And I would say it was, I don't know, 3 to 6 months into this, where more opportunities. We were still a small team at the time. It was easy to get visibility into what was going on in other areas. And that passion for beer and the opportunities in beer, we were, craft beer was really just at the onset of, we were about to go on a big heater at that time, right? Like, I think of one of the cool things about craft beer in general, we kind of went on like a 15-year heater, and I landed there right at the beginning of that. So pretty quickly there were a bunch of opportunities, and if you could have your shit together, show passion, and a willingness to learn and grow, there was a lot of opportunity for you.
Well, Andy, so you know the beers you were brewing first, and how you got trained. I mean, when was Two Hearted created, and were you there when it was first being made?
Yeah, so the original Two Hearted was really created. It actually predates my time at the brewery. So that was coming out of we had a small brew house tied to. Let me take a step back. So everything at the time was coming out of our original brewing location, where our pub still is in downtown Kalamazoo, Michigan. We had two brew houses that were essentially set up in what equated to roll up door garages that we turned into manufacturing areas. And there was a 2 barrel brew house back in what we call Brewery 1 B1, which is still an operating brewery. I've still got a brewer down there who makes specialty beers to this day for our pub at that site. And there was a small brew house that we had, and a member of our brewing team was devoted to that system. And the early work at Two Hearted took place on the old 2 barrel brew house in Bells that was in B1. It really, honestly, even predates that a little bit, as at the time we had a super passionate team, and the very earliest, I guess, interpretations of Two Hearted were probably made as homebrew recipes, with a couple members of our brewing team kicking tires on the early recipes for sure.
And then IPA back then. What did IPA mean to you as brewers, to consumers? Because I remember you were talking like maybe 2002, 3, 4. I was only tasting my first IPAs on draft,
Yeah.
and was hooked right away.
Yeah, I think when you go back, the IPA it's just been so dynamic, sort of the journey of that style. It's become, to me in a lot of ways, it is the American craft beer style, and it's become synonymous with craft beer in America. You think back to the origins of that, and I think when Two Hearted came about, I think a lot of people were still interpreting IPA as sort of that traditional English style IPA, different brewing techniques, different hop varieties, and all those kinds of things. So when you think about where it went in the early 2000s, and in the case of Two Hearted, I think that we first released Two Hearted in its current form in 97, I want to say. And then it was a very limited release annually from that time until, as we switched main brewing locations from downtown Kalamazoo out to Comstock, where our brewery is now. It remained a very limited kind of seasonal beer that would come out in the fall until I want to say it was 2005 or 2006. Getting back to your question, Jimmy, I think that, like, as as people really started to develop IPAs in the U.S. during that time period, the advent and usage of different American hop varieties that we were able to coax different flavors and aromas out of really started to drive IPA in a different direction. And it's kind of the early steps of what modern IPA has become, which is, you can't classify it in one box at all at this point. It's has evolved into um kind of an umbrella with just a bunch of different substyles in it. But I do think that those early days, if you're saying the early 2000s is when you're really first seeing IPA on draft from American craft breweries, those building blocks started there with an increase in hop usage rates and the type of aromas and flavors and the intensities of those flavors and aromas, really driving differences in where it had been.
No, that's a great intro. And then before we really dive into it, at that time, did you notice, was there a difference between a West Coast IPA, Midwest IPA, and an East Coast IPA, or was that not being talked about yet?
There's certainly, so when I think about the IPAs on the East Coast, there were certainly breweries making amazing hop forward beers at that time. And I think, obviously, if you think back, 10, 15 years ago, the advent of sort of these East Coast IPAs that, I think are really the genesis of hazy IPAs. I don't know that was being talked about then, but there were breweries making great IPAs on the East Coast without question. The West Coast IPA was certainly something that was talked about a lot. First of all, the breweries out there are we're making awesome beer. And I think that the amount of hops, particularly like kind of the hot side hopping, driving that intense bitterness, was something that people always associated with West Coast IPAs, particularly back then. And when I think about where we went with like IPAs in our part of the country, there was always a desire, certainly a desire from our brewery, and I think of the other breweries in our part of the country, to find some balance, to find some drinkability. So to find a balance between that aromatic intensity and the bitterness. And as IPAs have evolved over the last, say, certainly the last 20 years, new hop varieties and different ways of inputting those hops. And again, the continued coaxing of different, just aroma intensities and different types of aromas out of hops has just continued to evolve.
No, it's true. So also back then, so let's talk about the hop varieties that you had then.
Yeah,
So I know that for West Coast style, Cascade was one
sure.
hop that really had the West Coast identity. I know our friends, for our listeners, our friends at Siegel Hop Farm
Oh
out
yeah.
uh, that the it seems like Cascade was created there, and I know like old beer Anchor Liberty Ale, I guess, was one of the first beers that use it. But for you
Sure.
guys in the Midwest and Michigan, what were the hops that you were using then, and that also that helped define what Two Hearted was?
Sure. Yeah. So and it's a great question. I think that nice call out to Siegel. I don't know if John listens to your podcast. John's a great old friend of our breweries and me personally. So I love Siegel Ranch. And I think when you sort of think about these classic C hop varieties back then, a lot of those are public varieties. So I think Cascade is a hop that certainly gets used in hop forward hoppy beers, IPAs. Chinook on the bittering side, maybe CTZ, Columbus, and then of course Centennial, which is the hop that we brew Two Hearted with. That has of course evolved a little bit as some of the hop breeding efforts from different companies evolved. A lot of those hops have become synonymous with IPA brewing. And there were some early varieties. I think of like the SPG variety Warrior was something that was getting used. Maybe not quite in the early 2000s, but certainly by the mid 2000s, some of those hops were coming on. But building IPAs at that point of in the journey, we were definitely talking about what we'd call C hops.
Yeah. Well, I know that you guys did want to talk about Centennials. Um, so what is the flavor profile of Two Hearted? Because it's different. It's very drinkable. It's still even to this day. If that's a beer that I'll see on tap or in bottle at a bar or a restaurant, I'm going to order it because I know that I'm going to like it. But why do I like it so much?
And it's appreciate those comments and I think one of the reasons you like it is we do make a consistent beer, particularly on draft. It's a great draft beer if you are interested in having a craft beer. Whether you're out to dinner, whether you're at a beer bar, it's always a great choice for that because you're going to get a consistent outcome out of our brewery every time we make it. When I think about the flavor profile, I think that it really is. It's got it. It's certainly at this point. This is an old school IPA now, of course, and I think what it does is it balances notes of citrus, particularly, there's a little bit of orange, there's a little bit of lime, there's a big floral component that comes in from the Centennial. I get a good amount of geraniol from Centennial, so it's a mix of that floral, citrus, pine, and then we did build the beer. It's got malt backbone, so there's a mix of base malt, a little bit, just a tiny dash of caramel malt in there, and a little bit of higher kiln base malt in there as well. So I think that it really does deliver on that balance. There's a little bit of sweetness that comes from that malt backbone, but it's also it's well attenuated. The drinkability is great, and there's good aromatic intensity even to this day, even with it being an old school IPA with at this point, Centennial is an old school hop, and it's delivering some of those old school characteristics. There's still great aroma intensity and flavor, and it delivers consistently.
No, that's a great way to think about it. I mean, you mentioned the malt backbone.
Yeah,
Uh, that's a big part of it being so balanced, isn't it?
I think yeah, for sure. Like no doubt about it, especially when you think about the way that beer's brewed. There is a good amount of bitterness there, so the way that you one of the ways to balance that out as a brewer is deliver some of that specialty malt characteristics that are going to help balance out some of those. um we mentioned floral, pine, a little bit of earthy characteristic there, and the malt helps balance that out in a significant way without question.
How do you make it so that the malt becomes a backbone and balances out the flavor, but without it being malty?
Like primary to the whole thing. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
think first of all, you know, delivering it to folks fresh when those hops are really popping, and making sure that you're getting fresh beer out there. That's always super important. And it's a credit to the team here at the brewery, as well as our folks working out in the field, that we do deliver um, fresh beer to folks. I think that understanding the primary driver of the beer is the hops. So um, delivering the hops in a way, whether you're talking about hot side additions that deliver the bitterness, but also those are set up to have compounds that are very aroma positive. And then with the way we dry hop in our process, we're big believers in warm dry hopping. We're big believers in active fermentation dry hopping. That's always been the way that this beer has been dry hopped, going back to the very early days, before anyone was talking about interactions between yeast and different components of hops and hop oil. Just kind of through our development process, we always had a strong belief in how yeast and hops interact and how that produces our beer, even before there was a lot of science to back up what we were doing. There's obviously been a lot of that the last 10 to 15 years that support that process. But that was always the way it was built. So I think, to answer your question, I think it is understanding how to highlight the hops through your process that allow them to be what shines, and layering that malt in to be the backbone. And the other way you do that is with the proper kind of targets around your fermentability targets. So you make sure, if you want a beer to be drinkable and finish in a way, finish dry, you have to make sure that your fermentations deliver that. So in a lot of ways, it's a really simple beer, but you have to rely on your process and your fermentation process to deliver um, the finished product the way that we want to see it.
Yeah. So like in your career evolution, I'm going to try to tie your evolution into the evolution of the beers that Bell's makes.
Yep.
Um, how did at what point did you take on, like, what were some of the responsibilities you took on, after you'd been there 5 years or 10 years? And
Sure.
uh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So at about 5 years in, which we're talking 2005, by that point we had switched production facilities, and I had been working as a brewer by that point for 3 to 4 years, mostly on the cold side, doing shift work. From there, the responsibilities kind of evolved into, I kind of ended up the right hand person of the person who was the fermentation manager at the time. So ended up kind of having they didn't call it this. I will tell you, one of the stories of my career arc is being the person that does the job one time before that job gets a title, and then somebody else gets the job after me. Um, so there was like a cellar lead is what that ended up being called at the time, which none of this stuff exists around here anymore exactly in that way. But I had that job. From there, a brew house job opened up, and I really wanted to work in the brew house and round out more of my career skills, and got an opportunity to do that, and did that for a couple years. And then sometime about 10 years in, a little less, about 8.5, 9 years in, I got the ability to split time between production brewing. At the time, our production brew house was a 50-barrel brew house, and our specialty brewery, which is the aforementioned Kalamazoo brewery, where I still have a specialty brewer that runs that site. So I started splitting my time between those two sites. And what that afforded me was the ability to really start writing recipes professionally. And it also afforded me some ability to really get into the analytical side of recipe building. And I became, very engrossed in, from a quality perspective, our targets, and looking at at beer data and making adjustments to dial recipes in. So a couple years into that, sort of that evolved, and I went full time into just kind of running our specialty beer program downtown. And what happened was our head brewer at the time left the brewery, and it coincided with, this is about 2011 now, Jimmy. So that coincided with a huge project we had going on where we were putting in a large brew house and a 200 barrel brew house, and we were adding a bunch of cellar capacity. And I was sort of working at our Kalamazoo site. And then as that project evolved, our head brewer moved on, family opportunity, moved back to the other side, the east side. So in Michigan, you kind of go by two sides. There's the east side over by Detroit. We're over on the west side, kind of closer to
Okay.
Lake Michigan and Kalamazoo. So he goes back to that side of the state. And at that point, the project's kind of in high gear. And I sort of helped, took a prominent part of that project on, and I ultimately ended up helping commission the 200 barrel brew house. Coming out of that, that's when I was named head brewer for the first time, and I started managing the production brewing team at that point.
Wow.
So that's probably about 12 years into it. And then you probably don't want me to just blab on about this incessantly, Jimmy, but like from there, it's all evolved into where I am now.
Well, one thing I'm always curious about is, going from 50 barrel to 200 barrel. I
Yeah.
mean, what adjustments did you have to make, especially
Oh,
with the recipes?
whoo, man. Okay. That's actually a great question. And now you're talking about like one of the steepest, one of the steepest learning curves I ever went through in brewing. So at this point now, I may have still been interim head brewer as we were finishing commissioning up. I think as we commissioned that brew house is when I actually moved back out to the production brewery full time. And yeah, scaling those recipes. So I had by that point had become, very entrenched in our analytical system and dialing recipes in, and responsible for hitting targets and all those kinds of things, and making inspect beer. But as that project evolved, the equipment changed. We brought in completely different type of milling system, and there was some stuff going on from a raw material perspective. Malt kind of changes every year, and we were in the middle of what I would call a hot malt part of the journey. And so scaling recipes over from the 50 to the 200 barrel, dealing with different efficiencies, and then also having to dial in a lot of ways, like mostly talking about mash profiles and some of the more intricate components of scaling. I would call scaling up those beers in a different brew house. There was a steep learning curve there for sure. Um, yeah, I'll be honest, what you do is you put recipes together and you target things, you learn your efficiencies and you target outcomes. And then as more and more analytical data comes in, you understand what you have to do to adjust to get the recipes dialed into where they were. But like what a great, like that experience for me probably drove um drove what I've evolved into as a brewer more than anything, probably in my whole career. So that's about the halfway point of my career now, about 11 and a half, 12 years into this thing. It was a challenge, and like going through that as an experience as a young head of a department, which I hadn't led before. You grow up a lot, and you learn a lot. Like you learn a lot from experiences like that
Yeah.
professionally.
Well, Andy, when you're answering the question, it made me think about that time, let's say 2011, 12. And I knew a couple breweries that were trying to grow similarly, not as big, but maybe, 7 to 15 barrels to 100
Sure.
barrel. And I remember one, I don't want to name it, but I love them. They basically had to bring in a German trained brewer because it was a completely different system. and he changed the recipes so they were more so if they had a wheat beer, it was basically a Hefeweizen. If it was the lager pills, it was a German pills,
Yeah.
and it was the only way they could do it because it was such a change. And then I also noticed that more breweries as I got bigger also had people that had worked at macros, big breweries, because it really, I mean, it's a testament to you that you were able to make that jump, you know, with your small brewery background. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, couple of things. So that's a really good point. We did, of course, we were this was a large capital project, and we were buying a brew house at the time. And that brew house did, of course, during commissioning, we did have support from that team. I'll give a shout out to my mentor John Mallett now, as they came in. We knew what our identity was as a brewery and what we needed to do, and we had established our beers. Our 50-barrel brew house was it did have some of the components of larger brewing, so it's different than going from like a 7 barrel to 100. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
the thought of how that would go would be mind boggling. But as the commissioning team comes in, you do have to um work with folks and make people understand that there were just things that were non-negotiables in terms of how we were going to get there. And um we had enough, we had a ton of smart people working for us. We still do, we always have. That's been one of the great things about working here. And we just had to work to find to find the solutions to make the beers like we always had. And it was not without challenge. I assure you.
yeah. Well, since you mentioned John, I just realized that I don't know, a number of years back we interviewed him. He was the author of one of the Brewers publication books, and it was
Yeah.
Malt: A Practical Guide from Field to
Mhm.
Brew House. And it's interesting that a Bell's Brewery person wrote the book on malt. Um, you want to say anything more about him in that regard? Because we talked about the malt backbone of
Sure.
Hearted.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is I mean, obviously John is very well known for his impact on our company, but the industry as a whole. I am, blessed enough to call him a mentor. I would there were points where it probably felt like to him like I was a personal development project to his, I'm sure. So I have to give him a ton of credit for the work he did. And what I would say about the book, which is, first of all, the book is a very pragmatic look at malt. Malt can be very complicated, and it's a very digestible view into that. But what I would call out most about John is a lot of our experiences together really came through our shared passion of brewing raw materials, particularly malt and hops. So, um, I was brought into, it was about the time that I took on the role of head brewer, that I really was brought in a serious way to sort of our strategies around raw materials selection, raw material procurement, and all those kinds of things. And you know, m- most of my best memories of John are at either a malt house or a hop field. I assure you of that, or maybe at the brewery near the hop field after we were in the hop field. Those are probably my favorite memories. So we're still great friends, and I catch up with John all the time. And you know I don't know that I have a lot to add to that, other than he is just he's just one of the great brewers and one of the titans of our industry, and I'm just lucky to have gotten to work with him.
Yeah. Well, when we first started talking, I remembered when Bell's first came to New York City, which might have been 2012. I'm not sure exactly, but there had been a lot of buzz about it, and the rollout was amazing. It was pretty much a New York City Beer Week just for Bell's. But what did and still does, but Bell's Too Hard mean to Michigan and the Midwest? Because there's not too many beers that come to New York and take over in a week.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of regional pride around our brewery, around that beer. It's again, it's a go-to beer for so many people in our part of the country because of the consistency. And whether that is grabbing a 6-pack at your favorite store or a 12-pack or or on draft. Um, the fact that it is named for a river in the UP. I think that there's just a lot of identity, particularly in Michigan, tied to Two Hearted. Although, to your point, I think that it does go beyond that. First of all, it's available in a lot of places. It's not, you can find it on draft just about everywhere. But I do think that particularly in our part of the country, like it is just it's kind of the textbook balanced IPA. And, you know, a lot of people, I can't even tell you how many professional brewers that I talk to that tell me how, when they first started getting into craft beer, how it was a beer that they enjoyed and how it inspired them. So I think that, it's really a hallmark of consistency, and that's what drives a lot of it. But certainly a big thing for a lot of folks in this part of the country. No doubt
Yeah.
about it.
Well, jumping ahead to now, last fall your team reached out and kind of updated me on the beers that you're making. A whole bunch of what kind of Two Hearted inspired beers.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you that there was the Hazy Hearted and the Light Hearted. I don't know if I got to try the special Oberon, but just tell us how you you know develop those other beers and what they're like.
For sure. Yeah. So
Let's start with the lighthearted because I think that was the one I was drinking a lot.
yeah, for sure. I think, in general, one of the trends inside craft has certainly been to innovate inside of established brand families. And I like, so in my current role, as the state of our business has changed and original ownership has moved on. I'm very R&D focused. Like I have an R&D team. We've got a great pilot brewery here in Comstock that operates, where we develop a lot of these beers. What I would say about the stuff inside the Hearted family, and Lighthearted really being probably the first prominent sort of innovation inside that family, is our perspective has changed a little bit. Initially it was hard for us to think of, well, something's going to be a Two-Hearted variant, or inside the Two-Hearted family, like what is the tie that binds? So when you ask a brewer that, like, or someone like me who, has been going to the Pacific Northwest for, I think this year will be my 15th or 16th harvest, in person, going and selecting our hops, it's hard for me to not think that everything that we do inside that brand family needs Centennial. And and when we first did this, I think that there was alignment inside of our company that like we had to stay. There were more rigid guardrails, right, tied to the way that we would innovate those beers. And what we found is that as we looked at sub styles, that the things that really make Two Heart, or the Hearted, what we call the Hearted family now internally, what make the Hearted family the Hearted family, first of all, it's the quality. It is the care and the intentionality of the raw materials that we select, the way we put the beers together, and it's the quality and the consistency of those beers. And if we hold on to those things, we have the ability to maybe not be so rigid with like, why put restrictions on hop varieties or other elements of the beer that would make you think that they have to be, the same as Two Hearted, kind of. So now, going back to your lighthearted question, so that was a beer that we worked on. You're gonna make me mess dates up here, Jimmy, so we can fact check all this. But I want to say that was probably an innovation in, maybe probably probably hit the market in 19 or 20. It may have been 2020, which was obviously not great timing for any new products, for obvious reasons. And our play there was going after a light, sort of lower calorie IPA. At the time, you know, we have, well, and really this ethos still exists inside this brand family. We did want to stay true to what Hearted had always been, which is, sort of a core four plus maybe a little bit of cane sugar to dry the beer out type of approach to brewing. So, staying away from things like exogenous enzymes, staying away from things like no natural flavors inside of that brand family, to drive results. So that popped up as a challenge because you think about the way to really dry out and lighten up beers. The use of something like an exogenous enzyme can be very, very beneficial to brewing. We developed it up, and I want to say, and this is pretty typical as beers develop through our system. We probably did 5 pilot versions of it that were you kind of start wide. So inside our pilot brewery, we've got a like a smaller farmer tanks where we can split up one batch of wort and we can divide it out different ways and maybe do some back end things to drive different outcomes, let people, stakeholders in that, taste, see where we're at, and then you kind of develop and adjust from there. And that was the process with Lighthearted. Anytime you've got a calorie claim that you're making, you have to be like, that's regulated. So you have to be very, very intentional with the way you put the beer together. And then we were going for, obvious results around, again, aroma intensity. You'll hear me say the same things a lot: aroma intensity and flavor. One of the tricks with those light hoppy beers that I found is, you know, you do have to be careful and judicious with the amount of hops you use. It's easy to overhop those beers. So that was something that we thought about a lot as we were putting that beer together. And also things like when you're making light beers on your system, you need to be really intentional with certain parameters around work quality. So just sort of hanging on to those principles as we developed them up, really how that beer came to be.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's interesting. And I know you also have Hazy Hearted,
Yep. Yeah,
and
same thing there. Same but totally different in that certainly a different style than a light IPA. But in that case, like, we wanted to make a really great hazy IPA. So, obviously you're talking about different hop varieties than we would have used in something like Lighthearted or Two Hearted. You're talking about different usage rates. In the case of that beer, looking at different yeasts. So the processes for developing new beers, like they tend to be somewhat similar for all of them in some ways, but then each beer has its own journey and kind of story behind it too, in terms of how it comes to fruition. And I guess what I'd leave you with overall, when we think about Hearted, those quality principles are for us what make something worthy of being, receiving that name or being in the Hearted family. And while doing that, but leaving it open for the brewing team to look at different raw materials, specifically hops, and look at different methodologies than we've used to make great modern IPAs along, that stand up with our great old school IPA like Two Hearted.
yeah, this is going off topic, but it's relevant. You talk about how important the freshness is,
Yes,
and there was that mainstream TV commercial years ago where you saw the beer delivery guy pulling beer out of a store because it was past its date.
sure.
Um, how do you guys maintain freshness? There's a big chain, distribution and retail and accounts and all that.
Yeah, I mean that's obviously that's the execution of that is the secret to success for sure. I think what we really do is we fall back on our processes at our breweries, and you know, that focus on oxygen control in our process, particularly with hoppy beers, is kind of the main focus as it, as it leaves the brewery, or as it goes through its journey in the brewery, but as an operations team, at least as a on the brewing side and packaging side, all you can do is get it into a can, and then have your team get it on a truck, and then there's um beyond that, it can, things can go a certain way. So I think, the focuses are making sure that our oxygen control is where it needs to be through the brewing process, and then relying on our supply chain, our sales team, working with our awesome distribution partners to make sure that we're getting our beer on the shelf as quickly as possible. And and then it helps a lot when you're making tasty beers that people want to buy, and it helps inventory turn, and like, those are the most clear pathways to success, without doubt, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it makes me realize that just with a you must have a great equipment, and it's so I should be feeling pretty confident when I see a Bell's that it's going to be fresh and drink well, because I've noticed that. I feel like I've said, when I see Bell's, I'm always happy with it. So, but
Yeah,
I have a couple closer questions because we're going to close out soon. But just fun
sure.
ones.
Cool.
One, your team around you. You're the brewmaster.
Hmm.
When you were starting out, you had a title. It's like cellar lead.
Yeah,
Why don't you tell me a couple of the titles of the guys that work around you, guys and women that work around you, and if you want to, you can shout out some names.
sure. So my direct team, the team that is reporting directly to me, I've got one of our great brewers, Pat Takaz, who is an innovation specialist, and his job is, it's a pretty cool job. His job is mostly recipe design of new beers and specialty beers that we're making, particularly at our pilot scale. I've got another brewer who runs our pub brewery, and the title there would be Satellite Lead Brewery, our lead brewer, and that's our Kalamazoo brewery, our brewery we call B1. That is my guy Drew Rice. And then I've got three pilot brewers that also are on my team, report directly to me. And they are really kind of the execution team on the pilot and small brand side, on the as far as brewing goes. And that would be Mike Pete, Mike Alsop, and Dan Chapin. And beyond that, currently, as things have evolved, I've also got to give a shout out. I'm reporting into director of new product development for all of the New Belgium Bells team, and their name is Stephanie Palladino. She's my boss. She's rad. She is awesome. So those are a few folks that I guess I'm working with directly.
So there's a
Stephanie Palladino Martin, excuse
yeah,
me.
a lot of names with
Yeah.
faces. That sounds cool. Hey, another question. A lot of young people in the industry or want to get into it these days. What's a good pathway to becoming a brewer?
Geez, yeah, it's a great question. I think that number one, having an eye or a mind towards science is always helpful. So, if you're looking for some kind of background, whether that is chemistry, organic chemistry, biochem, like those type of backgrounds are a good place to start. And then there are just a bunch of accredited brewing programs that I think, if you really want to, if you really are looking at being it, and have interest in that it's great to go get that specialty certification. It's interesting. I mentioned to you, right place, right time. The early 2000s, it was a little bit more of a renegade force, and a lot of folks were into beer. It was passion for a lot of folks, and it was a cool time to be part of that industry. But there's a ton of great educational opportunities out there now for folks.
Yeah, different world. But thanks for that. And then it's that time of day out here in the East Coast. It's close to 6 p.m.
Yeah.
Uh, what do some of you guys drink for your shift beers? And you're going to tell me if you're at the B1 Kalamazoo spot or out
Yeah.
at Comstock.
Yeah, so we do have a place to have shift beers here in Comstock. There's an area with some packaged beer that folks will congregate and meet. But what I'll say about Bell's is, the heart Bell when I started at Bell's, we were 100% in downtown Kalamazoo. And to me, if you really want to experience the heart and soul of Bell's, that's where you go. You go to the original source. You go to downtown Kalamazoo, to our eccentric cafe, and down there are a bunch of different beers on tap. You've got pretty much any large distribution beer that you would expect to see anywhere on tap, available, always fresh, always awesome. And then you've got the B1 Brewery that is making a bunch of specialty beers that really only get poured there. So if you're a Bell's head or you like our beers and you haven't been to our original site in Kalamazoo, you're missing out, because there's a bunch of stuff there that that it's unlikely you've ever seen before. Um, and then along with that, we've got a bunch of beers that are coming out of our pilot program too. So there's a bunch of stuff on that is just tasting great. And let's see, I'll give you a couple of shift beers. So last Friday, I went down and we've got a program that comes out of our pub brewery, the B1 brewery, that's called First Friday IPA. So that's just a place where we do a different IPA recipe every month. And so one of the brewers brewed, it was actually one of the guys I mentioned, Mike Alsop. He did a recipe for a smash IPA. So some Wireman Vienna malt and a hop that is called 1019. That is a hop breeding company variety that hasn't been commercialized with the name. It's been around for a few years. So I had one of those last Friday that was tasting awesome, and then I had a Mexican hot chocolate stout, smaller pour of that one, and then I topped that off with just a little 5-ounce pour of. We've got an old school recipe that we haven't done in many years called raspberry ale, and that is just brewed with whole raspberries. A really simple kind of blonde ale recipe with a shitload. Am I allowed to swear? I'm sorry if I'm not. A heck load of whole raspberries, and
Heck yeah.
heck yeah, there we go.
Heck
And
yeah, bro.
then and they were tasting great. I I have to apologize because working in a brewery for 25 years, sometimes my language gets away from me. So hopefully you're not bleeping out a million words I said during the podcast.
No, you're pretty put together. Well, Andy, that's great, man. And I tell you what, I really appreciate talking with you, and thanks to your team at Bell's. We're gonna do another show with you one day, and then we dove into Two Hearted. That show will dive into Oberon because
That
that was
sounds
another
great.
one that just blew people's socks away.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, Andy Farrell. So great talking to you, bro.
Hey,
And
thanks, Jimmy.
and I'm Jimmy Carboni. I'm the host. Thanks to our engineer George. And we'll catch you next time on Beer Sessions Radio. All right.
Cheers, everyone.